Chack! A taser fired. An old man dropped, right beside his wife's grave. No threat, no resistance. Just a man in a worn Navy suit, holding a bouquet of lavender, treated like a criminal. When he hit the ground, 7 men appeared. No chants, no shouting, just silence, dress uniforms, boots hitting gravel in sync, and eyes that didn't blink. They didn't come to protest. They came to stand guard for the man who once taught them what loyalty really means. And the man that cop just tossed wasn't some nameless trespasser. He was Staff Sergeant Franklin D. Mercer, Bronze Star recipient, builder, mentor, a soldier who once ran through live fire to save 3 men in 1978. So now I ask you, if this happened in your state, what would you do? Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments, and welcome to Mr. 7 Stories, where truth marches in uniform. Like, subscribe and follow, because what happened next, you won't believe. The early autumn wind swept across the solemn hills of Valley Rest Memorial Grounds, sending faded red maple leaves skittering along the stone path. The evening sun faded behind the ancient oak trees, casting long shadows over the cold ground. A man in a dark navy suit stood motionless beside a freshly covered grave, his brown leather shoes sunk deep into the soft earth. Franklin D. Mercer, 70 years old, former Staff Sergeant of 4th Infantry Division, stood as if awaiting orders. But there was no commander now, no unit. The person he was waiting for was already gone. Helen Grace Mercer, his wife of 43 years, now rested quietly beneath the damp soil, still soft from last night's rain. "I'm here, Helen," he whispered, voice trembling. "I wore my best suit, the one you said made me look like a real gentleman." A breeze brushed past the headstones in reply, lifting the rose petals scattered around her grave and letting them fall again, quietly. He had been standing there for over an hour, not crying, not breaking down, just talking to her, saying all the things he hadn't said in time. The quiet Sunday afternoons, the simple laughter at the dinner table, the hand-holding through 3 years of chemo. Each word he spoke was a way to hold on to her just a little longer. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel broke the stillness. "Sir, I need to ask you to leave the cemetery immediately. The gates close at 6 p.m. A young male voice said, cold, firm, authoritative. Franklin turned. A young police officer. Tall, neatly trimmed hair, nameplate reading Officer Tyler Vexler, stood just a few feet away. His hand rested casually on his belt, right beside his taser, as if ready for a threat. I just need a few more minutes," Franklin said, voice hoarse. "I came from the funeral this morning. She's my wife. I was just saying goodbye." "Regardless of situation, you're violating city ordinance," Vexler interrupted, glancing at his watch. "Remaining on cemetery grounds after hours is considered trespassing. I need you to leave immediately." Franklin swallowed hard. The hands that once gripped weapons in battle now trembled, not from fear, but helplessness. "Are you married?" he asked, eyes still on the headstone. "If one day you had to bury her, could you walk away before saying your last goodbye?" For a brief moment, Vexler hesitated. Just one flicker of pause. Then his expression hardened again. "This isn't personal, sir. It's the law. If you don't comply, I'll have to place you under arrest for refusing a lawful order." Franklin inhaled deeply, as if trying to bury a pain that had no name. Helen used to say he was the strongest man she knew. But standing now, in this cold graveyard, before the woman he loved, he felt hollow. "Just 5 minutes, please," he whispered. But to Vexler, it wasn't a plea. It was defiance. He reached behind him. The metallic click of handcuffs broke the air. "Mr. Franklin D. Mercer, you are under arrest for trespassing on public property after hours. Please place your hands behind your back." At the hilltop, the sun had slipped behind the trees, and in the place meant to be the final resting ground of love, an old soldier was being handcuffed in silence, a silence no one bothered to understand. Franklin D., Mercer did not resist. He simply stood there. His thin, trembling hands didn't resist as Officer Tyler Vexler stepped behind him and locked the handcuffs around his wrists. Swiftly, decisively, the cold clink of metal echoed like a misplaced note in a farewell song that had never been sung. And even in that moment, Franklin held a posture few could match. Back straight, eyes forward, as if standing in review before a sacred memory. He'd stood like that before at Fort Hillcrest, where he received the Bronze Star nearly 3 decades earlier, after sprinting through gunfire to drag 3 wounded men to safety. It was the summer of 1978, in a remote mountain valley where war didn't care about age or intention. He was only 23 then, but his eyes had already grown older than most men twice his age. When he left the service in 1984, due to a knee injury, Franklin didn't abandon duty. He just changed battlefields. He moved to East Arnell, Kentucky, became a builder, laying foundation for neighbors, pouring concrete at schools and churches. Every brick he set was level, measured, and placed with quiet pride. Helen, the woman with a laugh like early spring sunlight, was the only person who ever truly understood him. They met at a veterans memorial in 1980. She brought flowers. He brought wounds that hadn't healed. They married 7 months later. Because as Helen once said, when you know, no need to wait. For 43 years, she kept him grounded. When nightmares from the war returned, when the smell of motor oil in the summer reminded him of old artillery outposts, she was his shelter, his peace, in a world that only the two of them truly understood. When Helen was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, Franklin didn't hesitate. He turned down every construction contract. He drove her to Riverside Hospital for chemotherapy every Monday, held her hand through every wave of nausea, rubbed her shoulders on nights the pain wouldn't let her sleep. They sold their 2009 pickup, canceled cable. But Franklin never once complained. If I could trade it all for 3 more months with her, he told the doctor, I'd do it in a heartbeat. Tyler Vexler didn't know that. How could a young officer, whose biggest heartbreak was a college breakup, begin to understand the weight of each step Franklin had taken? On the dirt path leading to his wife's grave, as the cuffs tightened, Franklin let out a soft exhale, not from pain, but from the feeling of being severed, from the decades he had sacrificed and built in that cemetery, a place that should have been the peaceful end, to a love that had carried 2 people through the trenches of real life. He was treated like a trespasser, and something inside him, the part that once believed dedication would always be met with dignity, began to crack. Franklin D. Mercer bowed his head as Officer Tyler Vexler began reading him his Miranda rights, the words delivered in a flat tone, like a worn-out recording on loop. But Franklin wasn't listening, not because his hearing had faded, but because his mind was somewhere else. There, Helen was still alive, wearing the linen hat he'd bought her at the weekend market, knitting on their old wooden porch chair, legs swaying gently in the East Darnell breeze. He hadn't come to Valley Rest Cemetery to mourn. Franklin had come like a soldier to report for his final mission, to the one person who had walked beside him through 4 decades of domestic war. Every chemo session was a battlefield, every sleepless night a prolonged ambush, and she, Helen, was the only one who had ever stood watch with him through the long campaign of life after combat. In the Army, he once told his son, Lucas, rule number 1 is you never leave a comrade behind. And your mama, son, she was the best comrade I ever had. And now, they were telling him to leave his wife's grave? As Officer Vexler gently pulled his cuffed hands toward the patrol car, Franklin suddenly let out a short, dry laugh, a sound so strange and hollow, it made the young officer pause for a split second. Is something funny, sir? Vexler asked, his tone tightening with irritation. Franklin turned his head, his eyes suddenly bright with memory. You know, he said, I was captured by a group of North Vietnamese soldiers back in '76. Hands tied, eyes covered, no food for 3 days. He paused. But at least they let me say a final word to the wounded men I served with before they dragged me away. Vexler said nothing. Franklin shrugged lightly. And now here I am, on my own soil, in front of my wife's grave, being arrested for loving her too long. No one answered. Only the soft crackle of the radio and the slow rotation of red and blue lights sweeping over rows of headstones. He looked up at the sky, where the first stars had started to flicker. In the back of his mind, he could hear Helen's voice calling from their porch. "Frank, don't forget to water the lavender." That voice, clear as spring air, he'd never forgotten, even as his memory had begun to blur around the edges. "If she were here," he mumbled, "she'd tell me to stay calm, and scold me for getting handcuffed in the last decent suit I own." Though the pain inside cut deep, Franklin didn't lose the soldier in him. His dry humor wasn't meant to impress. It was a lifeline, a way to stay anchored in the middle of a reality so absurd it hardly felt real. Because even with his hands cuffed, even being escorted away from the place he called his final foxhole, Franklin Mercer held to one truth: you never leave the ones you love behind, whether in the jungle or in a cemetery. And if that meant spending a night in jail, so be it. As long as Helen knew, he stayed until the very end, with his hands shackled behind him. Franklin D. Mercer took slow, unsteady steps toward the East Arnell Police Precinct patrol car. Each footfall sent a sharp pain through his old knee injury, the same injury that ended his military career. But he kept his back straight, head up, for Helen, for himself. Officer Tyler Vexler, 27, walked just behind him, one hand on his utility belt, eyes scanning the surroundings like he was tracking a suspect. He'd only been assigned to the area 8 months earlier. You could still see traces of the academy in his posture, fast, rigid, like he was expecting an evaluation at any moment. Vexler didn't know how to read the elderly. He'd never seen a person hollowed out by grief. In his eyes, hesitation looked like resistance. And tonight, he was determined to follow procedure. This was, after all, his chance to prove himself to the captain. "Sir, can you pick up the pace?" Vexler said sharply. "We don't have all night." Franklin stumbled slightly. His knee was shaking now, his lower back throbbing after 3 weeks of sleeping upright beside Helen's hospital bed. He paused to catch his breath. "Try standing for 45 years, he gasped, "and then losing the person you love most, and see if you can still walk like a 20-something. You're resisting?" Vexler froze, narrowing his eyes. "Resisting?" Franklin gave a tired smirk. "I'm just sitting down for a moment." And he did sit, not out of defiance, but exhaustion, on the stone bench beside the row of graves. Franklin lowered himself as if removing a heavy suit of armor. There was no strength left to hold himself up, no pride left to protect, only pain. Vexler immediately stepped back, hand reaching for his radio. "Dispatch! This is Unit 4 Charlie. I've got a non-compliant individual. Possible refusal to comply with arrest. Subject sat down and is refusing to move, requesting backup." That's when something unexpected happened. Something Vexler hadn't prepared for. From across the grounds, a young boy, no older than 10, came running, pulling his mother along behind him. She wore a burnt orange trench coat and carried a bouquet of wild daisies. "Mom, look, it's the man who gave me the folded flag on Memorial Day." The woman froze. She recognized him instantly, the same elderly man who had spoken to her son for over half an hour at the East Arnell Veterans Center, teaching him that a soldier never fights alone. She stepped forward. "Excuse me, officer, what exactly is going on here?" Her voice was calm, but firm. Vexler frowned. "Ma'am, this man is trespassing and refusing orders to leave the cemetery." "Trespassing? He buried his wife this morning. That's Mr. Mercer, the same man who built the porch roof on my house and refused to take a dime. You're calling this trespassing?" Her words hit like cold water on a rising flame. Vexler's face flushed red. Before he could answer, 2 more patrol car lights flared at the edge of the cemetery. Backup had arrived. Franklin, still seated on the bench, slowly raised his eyes to the sky. "Helen," he thought, "now you have to watch me be dragged away, instead of spending just a few more minutes with you." He never imagined the cemetery would be the place he'd have to fight for the right to love someone to the very end. But tonight, at Valley Rest Memorial Grounds, that battle had begun, and the ones he found himself up against were wearing the same uniform he once wore with honor. The two backup units lit up the gravel path in flashing red, slicing the dark with urgency. Tonight, the cemetery was no longer a place of rest. It had become a stage for a tragedy spinning out of control. Officer Tyler Vexler still gripped his radio, breath tight and uneven. He hadn't expected this kind of attention. He hadn't expected anyone to speak up, especially not a mother with a child in tow, someone who remembered an old man for the quiet kindness the world so often forgot. "Ma'am, please step back," Vexler said quickly, noticing her inching toward Franklin. "This doesn't involve you." "Oh, but it does," she replied, eyes locked with his. "When an old soldier who just buried his wife gets treated like a criminal for sitting down to breathe, it absolutely involves me." Franklin sat motionless, his hands cuffed behind his back, his gaze drifting toward Helen's grave. He no longer had the strength to argue, but he heard every word, carried by the cold wind. One of the officers from the new units, Deputy Jace McCullers, in his 30s, stepped forward, voice brisk and clipped. "What V we got non-compliant subject?" Vexler nodded. "He's refusing to get up. I've given multiple warnings." McCullers glanced at Franklin. "Get up, old man. Now!" Franklin tried to shift his shoulders, bracing to rise, but his knees gave out. He barely lifted himself before collapsing back onto the stone bench, breath short and labored. Vexler didn't wait. All he could hear in that moment was the training. Control the situation. Never lose command. Never look weak in front of backup. But then, he paused, just for a beat. He's a veteran, not a criminal. The thought surfaced, quiet, nearly drowned out by the crackle of the radio, and the unspoken pressure from the watching officers. Vexler scanned his surroundings. People were gathering. Phone lights now cast harsh beams on his every movement. If I hesitate, I lose control. In that brief flicker of indecision, Vexler chose reaction over reflection. Dispatch, confirm. Subject is non-compliant and unresponsive to verbal command, requesting permission to deploy assisted control device. He said into the radio, hand resting on the grip of his taser. "No!" the woman cried, pulling her son back. But it was too late. Check! A cold, piercing snap tore through the cemetery air. Electric current leapt from the taser, piercing through the dark navy fabric of Franklin's suit, sending a shock wave through his body. His limbs seized. He slumped forward, his body crashing against a stone bench. A full body jolt. Physical, spiritual. There was no screaming, only the wind whipping through rows of silent headstones, and the dull, lifeless thud of a 70-year-old man collapsing beside the grave of the woman he loved. The child burst into tears. His mother covered his eyes. Late visitors at the cemetery began gathering at the gates, pulling out their phones to record. A middle-aged man, wearing a jacket with the East Darnell Veterans Association badge, stepped up to the fence, voice sharp as steel. "What the hell did you just do?" "That's Mercer. Franklin D. Mercer. He saved 3 men on Langston Hill in '78. Do you even know that?" Vexler didn't move. The taser still vibrated in his grip. And that's when it hit him. The wave he had just unleashed wasn't going to be silenced by a carefully worded report. Franklin lay curled on the cold stone path, his eyes half open, fixed on a headstone etched with the name Helen Grace Mercer. He no longer heard the officers shouting. He only heard Helen's voice, soft as breath. "You were always right, Frank, even when they couldn't see it." "Franklin D." Mercer lay on his side, chest rising and falling with effort, his breath heavy, erratic. His old Navy suit was dirted, the buttons misaligned, his once polished shoes now stained with mud, from the patch of grass near her grave, and just a few steps away, a headstone carved with the words, Helen Grace Mercer, beloved wife, loyal friend, eternal light. He had once stood through gunfire. He had once heard the roar of artillery overhead. He had once watched friends fall before their names could be spoken. But this moment, bound, humiliated, before the grave of the woman he loved more than life itself. This was the pain he could not bear. The crowd outside the cemetery gates had now grown to nearly 20 people. Phone lights tracked every movement of the officers, and whispers had turned to murmurs of discontent. Then, from Hartwell Ridge Highway, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb. Its door flung open. A young man stepped out, dressed in full U.S. Marine Corps uniform. White gloves pristine, dark leather belt cinched tight, metals gleaming under the yellow floodlights. Dante Elridge, 29 years old, a veteran once mentored by Franklin Mercer during a workshop at the East Arnell Veterans Center, stepped forward without a word. He pulled out his phone, typed one line into a private group chat. We've got a situation. One of ours got arrested. Valley Rest Cemetery. Come. In uniform. 7 minutes later, 6 silhouettes appeared at the far end of the road. No names. No instructions. They just came, like quiet sentinels guarding an old but undying code. Nick Shaw, Devin Hale, Trey Colson, Malik Ford, Owen Red, Scott Levesque, all in full dress uniform. They moved in single file, flanking Dante as if in silent formation. No words, just a measured rhythm of boots on gravel. A voice from the crowd whispered, Marines? They're Marines. The people parted. No one asked. They just knew. The officers, mid-argument over their radios, fell silent, eyes catching sight of the 7 soldiers walking through the cemetery gates. No shouting, no slogans, no aggression, but the way they walked, heads high, shoulders squared, eyes unwavering, thick in the air like static before a storm. Even the crowd hushed. No one spoke, but every eye, from the young mother to the boy clutching her side, from the veteran in the jacket to the stranger recording on his phone, followed those boots as if witnessing a sacred ritual. It was a silent understanding between civilians and servicemen. Honor is being defended tonight, and not by the police. Vexler, the officer who'd pulled the taser, took an instinctive step back when Dante's gaze met his, not out of fear, but because suddenly he felt small. Dante walked straight to Franklin, still collapsed near Helen's grave, and knelt down. He checked his breathing, his pulse, eyes narrowing with muscle memory from battlefield triage. Deputy McCullers stepped forward, hand still hovering near his sidearm. Who is he to you? He asked. Dante didn't look up. He's the man who pulled me out of the dark, he said quietly, and he never fought alone. The 7 Marines took formation, half circle around Franklin. No threats, but no one could get through. Their presence didn't escalate. It transformed the scene. Tonight, Valley Rest Memorial Grounds no longer belonged to law enforcement. It belonged to something older, something harder to train for, something deeper than protocol. It belonged to men who never learned how to turn their backs on one another. Franklin D. Mercer still lay on his side beside the stone bench. His heart pounded heavily, but his eyes had opened again, and the first thing he saw wasn't a police officer. It was 7 Marine Corps uniforms, standing in a protective arc around him, like an old support formation. Except this time, they weren't holding weapons. They were holding honor. Dante Elridge crouched down, lifting Franklin with both arms. Steady, gentle, checking his pulse as he whispered, We're here now, Mr. Mercer. No one touches you again. Officer Tyler Vexler froze. He thought he understood scene control, but no academy course had ever trained him to stand before 7 motionless Marines, their stares as cold and sharp as fixed bayonets. From behind them, a new vehicle pulled in. No siren, No flashing lights. Just a civilian SUV with official plates. Lieutenant Gavin Rourke, Chief of East Darnell Police, stepped out. White shirt, sleeves rolled up, tie loose at the collar. Face grim. He didn't look at his own officers. He walked straight toward Dante. "Are you the commanding officer here?" Dante shook his head. "No, sir. There's no command out here. Just brothers." Rourke nodded. "Barely. We receive at least a dozen calls about a taser being used on an elderly man at a cemetery. Does Mr. Mercer have legal grounds to remain on site after the service?" Dante didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a slightly wrinkled envelope. From inside, he unfolded a stay authorization issued by Director Carl Jennings, granting family members of the deceased access to Valley Rest Memorial Grounds. Until 10 p.m., Rourke frowned. "Did any of you check his paperwork?" Deputy McCullers stammered. He didn't present anything. "How was he supposed to?" Came a sharp voice from the crowd. It was the young mother, the one whose son had once received a folded flag from Franklin. Her hand gripped the boy's tighter. The boy didn't blink. Eyes locked on the old man slumped on the bench. The air thickened. Then, something unexpected shifted the moment. From the far edge of the parking lot, Marisol Vega, owner of the small grocery store near the cemetery, walked forward, holding an iPad. She said nothing. She simply hit play. The screen showed security footage, captured just that morning. There was Franklin in his navy blue suit, holding a bouquet of flowers, walking alongside a cemetery staff member, into a restricted section. Calm, quiet, respectful. Rourke looked at the screen, then fixed his eyes on Vexler. "Did you check the security footage?" Vexler bowed his head. "Did you even ask him who he was burying?" Silence. "Do you know what medals that man earned in service to this country?" Silence. Rourke let out a slow breath, then turned to Dante. "We'll handle this internally. I give you my word. But if you see anything else, anything off, I want to hear it directly from you. Not through the media, not through headlines." Dante nodded. "We're not here to destroy. We're here to witness." From that moment on, the balance of power shifted. The police were no longer at the center. The crowd had gathered around the young Marines, as if they were the real guardians of justice. Their silence spoke louder than any chant. Franklin, leaning against the bench, looked around, and for the first time that day, he smiled. Not because everything was okay, but because he knew Helen hadn't seen him left alone. Because honor, though temporarily insulted, always finds its way back to where it belongs. Franklin D. Mercer sat upright, back against the cold stone bench near Helen's grave. His wrists were free now, though the red marks left by the cuffs still showed. In front of him stood that same semicircle of uniforms. Dante Elridge and his 6 brothers, forming a human shield between Franklin and those who had doubted him, humiliated him. Lieutenant Gavin Rourke turned, his voice low but firm. "Officer Vexler, Deputy McCullers, step back. Now!" Vexler didn't protest. Sweat gathered at his temple. His steps were slow, as if the weight of his uniform had suddenly doubled. From the cemetery gate, an old Buick sedan rolled into the gravel lot. A silver-bearded man in a brown wool coat stepped out. Carl Jennings, director of Valley Rest Memorial Grounds. "Franklin," Jennings called out, his voice cracking at the sight of his longtime friend. Humiliated and worn. "I just got the call." "Good God." He pulled a folded document from his coat, a duplicate stay permit, identical to the one Dante had already shown, but with a special notation. Extended access approved until 10 p.m. due to family medical concerns and personal request. Jennings turned to Rourke. "I signed this myself this morning. Everything was in order, and I can confirm Mr. Mercer violated nothing." Rourke nodded slowly, the weight settling into his shoulders. "I know, and now I have to make it right." The next morning, at East Darnell Police Headquarters, a special press conference was held. Chief Rourke stood behind the podium. his face somber, unflinching. Beside him stood Carl Jennings, and behind them, a still frame from the cemetery footage. Franklin Mercer, cuffed and stunned, in full dress blues, crumpled beside a grave. "We acknowledge," Rourke said, "that a serious failure occurred. A decorated veteran, a grieving husband, was treated unjustly, and for that, this department pledges reform." Then he announced a new policy. No citizen over the age of 65 shall be detained for a minor civil offense without direct approval from a commanding officer present at the scene. The sound of cameras clicking erupted around the room. A reporter from the Darnell Ledger raised his hand. "What about Officer Vexler?" Rourke didn't flinch. "He will be placed on immediate administrative leave, pending an internal investigation for abuse of authority and a full review of his situational judgment." On the other side of town, at the East Darnell Veterans Center, a quiet gathering took place. No stage, no speeches, just a circle of uniforms and one empty chair in the middle, reserved for Franklin. He arrived 10 minutes late. Before coming, he'd returned to Valley Rest Cemetery, not to make a statement, just to place a single lavender flower on Helen's grave. "I didn't let them separate us," he whispered. "Not while I can still stand." And this time, no one stopped him from staying as long as he wanted, within a week of the East Darnell press conference. Franklin D. Mercer's story had spread across Kentucky, then beyond county lines, beyond ridge lines and power poles, into thousands of homes across America. They called it the Valley Rest Incident. The press described it as a wake-up call. Local stations aired the footage 3 times a night. The image of the elderly man, cuffed in full military dress beside his wife's grave, became a symbol of misunderstood pain and quiet resilience. Franklin received over 300 handwritten letters, thousands of emails, and countless Facebook messages from strangers, veterans, widows, nurses, teachers, even first-year law students. One woman from Vermont wrote, "Mr. Mercer, I didn't know your name before this. But the way you stood, the way you sat back down, the way you didn't fight back even when you were wronged, taught me that honor doesn't have to shout to be seen." A high school student in Texas wrote in shaky pen, "I've never met a real soldier, but I think you're a hero." Franklin read every letter, slowly, seated in the small kitchen of his East Darnell home, a soft desk lamp casting light on an old wedding photo of him and Helen, hanging by the window. Then he pulled out a cream-colored stack of stationery, the kind Helen used with classic blue trim, and began writing 7 letters by hand, one for each man who stood beside him that night. Dante Elridge, Nick Shaw, Devin Hale, Trey Colson, Malik Ford, Owen Red, and Scott Levesque. In each letter, he wrote, "You call me a hero, but that night it was you who saved me, not from the cuffs, but from the feeling of being abandoned in a world that no longer seemed to understand the value of loyalty." He signed each letter in blue ink. Franklin D. Mercer, Staff Sergeant, read, "Still standing, never let go," and with every letter, he enclosed a small silver pin, each one engraved with, "Peacetime Brothers, Valley Rest 2025. When asked on local television how he felt about becoming a symbol of justice, Franklin simply smiled. "No one wants to become a symbol by being mistreated," he said. "But if it helps another soldier, another old man, someone grieving, get treated with more dignity, then I'll carry it." That was the lesson he wanted to leave behind. Calm isn't weakness. Loyalty isn't outdated. And sometimes the silence of a man standing by his wife's grave can make an entire nation stop and listen. One December afternoon, Franklin D. Mercer returned to Valley Rest Memorial Grounds. The first snowfall had just begun, dusting the stone steps with white as he walked the familiar path. In his hands, a small bundle of lavender, wrapped in old newspaper, the kind Helen used to keep in a jar by the kitchen window. He stood before her headstone, eyes quiet but clear, no more tears. The pain beneath his heavy coat had cooled with time, but in its place, something warmer had begun to burn again, a rekindled belief. "I'm still here, Helen," he whispered, gently placing the flowers at her grave. "And maybe, just Maybe because of you, people remember what honor looks like. Not far away, a group of high school students was visiting the cemetery for a local history project. One girl, wearing a blue beanie and holding a small camcorder, spotted him. "That's him," she whispered. "Mr. Mercer, the soldier from the cemetery." No one disturbed him, but every eye followed him, and in those looks, there was no pity, only respect. Franklin was no longer the man in cuffs by his wife's grave. He had become a living reminder that some things never go out of style. Courage, loyalty, and the quiet way a man holds on to love, even when the world lets go. After that night at Valley Rest, a lot had changed. The East Darnell Police Department began internal reforms, adding new training programs focused on interacting with elderly citizens and veterans. Young officers were required to relearn the basics of situational judgment. A local high school launched a course called Honor in Peacetime, and Franklin was invited to speak. He didn't say much. He talked about Helen, about their quiet dinners, about the fear of losing her when illness struck, about simply being present when the one you love can't be there anymore. And then he said something that silenced the entire room. "I thought I'd lost everything, but sometimes God lets you fall, just so someone else can lift you up and remind you that real values are still alive. We've just forgotten how to see them." When Franklin left the stage that day, the students stood and applauded, not because he delivered a powerful speech, but because he lived the truth he spoke. Honor doesn't need noise. It can wear an old military coat, stand quietly in falling snow, place a flower on a grave, and still carry more power than any speech ever could. Honor doesn't age. And sometimes those we think have laid down their arms are the ones holding on to it most faithfully